Surprise. Just a quick test. I'm waiting to see. I will be talking here until I know that there's some people in here. If anybody joins in. Nobody yet. Anybody? Test, test. Anybody out there? If there's anybody watching, just pop something in the chat just to let me know that you can hear, please. Anybody? Bueller? Bueller? Nobody. Okay. This is going to go well. Just waiting. Anybody? Pop something in the chat if you can hear me, please. I just need to make sure that this is all working in all good order. Can anybody hear me? Excellent. Oh, good. People can hear me. That's surprise. We're doing a Saturday morning live stream just because I felt like it. So I sound good. Oh, that's best compliment I've had all day. So that's mind you, it's not even noon, so that's probably not a bad thing. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or evening, or wherever you happen to be. As I was saying, just a quick Saturday live stream. We haven't done one of these in a little while. We're in between episodes at the moment. We did, hopefully most of you have already watched, or all of you have watched. We did an hour-long episode last week, which I think was actually came out really, really well in terms of the topic. But those long episodes take an awful lot of work and preparation and everything to go into it. So we're in between episodes right now. Hopefully back soon with another episode. But in the meantime, I figured I would do a live stream and Q&A and just sort of. I like doing these for people who have watched them in the past. I think they're for me they're fun. Like it's a nice interesting sort of conversation that can happen, and bit of feedback and interaction, all those things. So I don't really have anything to talk about so much this morning. If people have questions, certainly pop them into the chat. Please feel free to do that. I'm happy to answer questions, give my thoughts and opinions on what is preferably more Cold War related than anything else. But if you ask questions that pique my interest about anything else, I may or may not answer. I may or may not answer about the Cold War as well. So, but yeah, that's we've got a viewer from Shanghai. This is the challenge I find with logging in at this time and sort of doing this work at this time is I miss a lot of our Asia Pacific people, but this happens to be the time that I am awake and sort of raring to go. So hang on one second. I've just got a message coming in that I really should check because it's from one of my producers. I really should take a look at that. Oh, there we go. That's one of my producers just saying nice. So there we go. Okay, in the chat, we've got about 40 people or so in here right now, that's not for just sort of jumping in, Saturday morning, no warnings, no scheduling, anything like that. That's not bad on a Saturday morning or a Saturday morning for me. As I said, pop questions in to the chat. Happy to try and answer what I can. More episodes about Cold War effect on the Middle East. Yeah, we're coming back to. We've got a couple of episode ideas in that plant, and in the works right now for some more Middle Eastern regional themed, well, not necessarily themed, but Middle East centered topic focuses. So that is an area we are going to be coming back to, hopefully with a bit of an interesting angle that we can sort of present on it, something that isn't necessarily thought of or talked about necessarily too much within the sort of the broader general context. So Cambodia and Prince Sihanouk. Yeah, we are going to be getting into to Cambodia. We are while we're looking at the Middle East stuff, we're also very much looking at the starting to active work on Vietnam, getting that ready, and obviously Nordam Sihanouk and Cambodia and everything plays very heavily into that, especially from the late 60s sort of onwards. So we definitely will be getting in with that. Might be a little bit before we get there, but we are definitely working our way towards that topic. So um, let's see. Here's an interesting question. Is this moment, and I'm assuming when you ask this, is this moment more dangerous than 1950 or the Cuban crisis? And I'm assuming by this moment you mean sort of like now, the present 2024. Um, I It's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of I'm not going to say discussion, but there's a lot of ideas that are certainly are being presented and coming out that way. The Cuban Missile Crisis is probably still the single most dangerous moment, just because of how close things came to nuclear exchange. Um, but 1950, and I've done this some talked on to this point before. 1950 sort of is this like, really a super dangerous moment um, in the Cold War, because as the Korean War starts, there's this exchange of hostilities that directly involves both sides, both the Soviets and I'm going to say the Soviets and the socialist world, because China was very much heavily involved, obviously at that point. Um, but the peace mechanisms and the dialogue mechanisms that sort of built up through the Cold War weren't particularly in place. There was no, the red telephone didn't exist. Like there's all these other things that are happening, um, that happened later in the Cold War, that are established, that aren't there in 1950. And I very much think that in a lot of ways, we're in a similar moment here. A lot of those Cold War structures and those Cold War dialogue functions don't exist anymore, or if they do exist, they fall into the wayside and they're not seen as any being important or with any kind of relevance. Um, is it I mean, how do you quantify, is this a more dangerous moment now than what it was in the past, et cetera? I don't think it's really possible to necessarily quantify that per se and say, yes, this is more dangerous than a time in the past. But I think there's certainly discussion and merit to the idea that we are living in a particularly dangerous time, simply because mechanisms for dialogue and discussion don't exist. There also isn't, and I was having this discussion with somebody on social media the other day. We're also in between at this moment in time where we don't have a wide I don't think we have a generalized wide fear of nuclear weapons, um, the way that we did we as a society, we as a planet, as a species had, especially by the 70s and definitely into the 80s, in terms of that fear of nuclear annihilation. I don't think a lot of I'm not going to say a lot of people, but I think there's a wide spectrum of people that don't necessarily appreciate just how world humanity ending, the world will continue, humanity won't, in the event of a nuclear exchange. So it's an interesting question with a whole lot of discussion that can sort of be built around that. But hopefully, that's sort of a couple of ideas to get people thinking, if that's something that keeps you up at night, kind of like it does me. So there we go. Um, let's see. And just, I mean, I say this through every live stream as irregular as they seem to be recently. I will read through questions and sort of the chat goes on without me as I'm rambling on. I will try to pick out questions. I won't promise to answer every question, but like ones that seem interesting, or I think there's the potential for a nice bit of dialogue, whatnot. I'll certainly try to address those. So, but I do, like anything, I reserve the right not to address something I don't want to address. So it's a host prerogative. How did communism and socialism seem to spread through multiple non-aligned countries so easily? Okay, so I think I learned something the last time. I can pin that message in here. How did communism and socialism seem to spread through multiple non-aligned countries so easily during the Cold War? The ideas of socialism, the ideas of communism very much take root in societies where there's deep inequalities, where people don't have access to have a political voice. That's very much a function of inequality, whether that's political inequality, economic inequality, social inequality, all those different strata. When people don't feel that they do not have access, um, they will turn to alternative means. And that's very much the case. I mean, you look at the world in the 1950s, 1960s onwards into the present. You look at societies where there's growing measures of inequality. That's very much where you start seeing um, It's very much where you start seeing this like this growth of like the ideas of communism or socialism, which is whether you however you buy into the idea of whether it's works or it's like functionality, et cetera, the ideas that underpin it are all about equality and about open access to the levers of power and to the to basic living type type things. If you live in a shack, like socialism and like the ideas of communism might actually seem quite appealing. They don't necessarily, but they might seem much more appealing than they would if you're part of the middle class, for example. um, and that it's like you're able to go vote and you have a steady paycheck and you're able to buy groceries, like there's all these different things. um, the world in the 1950s and the 1960s was very much like once you get into the develop what we call the developing world, away from the white people. It's was very much like it's like stratification, social and economic stratification, where there's this very small group of rich elites at the top, and everyone else had nothing. So it's not a surprise in that type of situation where people would turn to the ideas of socialism and communism, which makes a promise. No, I mean, again, like the ability to fulfill it is something completely different, but it makes the promise of equality and access to resources and a voice. At the end of the day, people want a voice. Like that's really what it comes down to. Oh, there's my wife. Hello. She brought me lunch. And she's leaving again. So there we go. There's a little slice into the Cold War's personal life. So, anyways, that's my rambling little bit there on in terms of why I believe that that communism and socialism do take root like that in specific situations. Let's see. Uh, da, is the Sino-Soviet split a proven failure? Com- w- I, I'd like to see more clarification in terms of what you mean by that question. Is that because Russia and China are now allies of convenience at the moment? I mean, they patched things up in the 90s to a degree. Like, we need to. I think it's a very dangerous trend that people seem to want to do, to draw a line that something happened 70 years ago or 60 years ago and ignore everything that's happened in between and then see an event now and say that these two things are directly related, or there's a direct that nothing. It's ignoring everything that's happened in the middle. um, Soviet Russia and China are friends of convenience at the moment, and anybody who thinks otherwise, these are not firm allies. Russia has a bunch of things that China wants, and yeah, we'll leave it at that. But I think there's a lot that goes into that question. But I mean, if I'm not addressing the nature of your question particularly, Brandon, please do post a follow-up comment, and I'll try to come back to it. But I think it's very dangerous to sort of see like that the failure, like the Soviet Sino-Soviet split failed because there's allies there, they exist as allies of convenience now. I think that's a very dangerous proposition to make. Um, yes, my name is Impromptu. So there we go. That's let's see. I'm sorry, I'm just going through a couple of questions here. From Jay Gray, can we talk more about Australia and New Zealand? Um, it's a it's a region that I would like to do more coverage of, but it's also a region that's hard to come up with Cold War themed topics that are really that are going to draw in big numbers. And this isn't it's a slight at all towards Australia and New Zealand. We did do a look at the Petrov affair and sort of the events of that and the political ramifications and what happened afterwards. There's a few more Cold War topics that sort of play into the 70s. Um, and then of course New Zealand and its anti-nuclear stance, which becomes really important. But it's a and then nuclear testing in Australia. So there's Marilinga and all those things. So there's definitely some topics that we can look at, but it's definitely an awkward region to sort of get into with a bunch of in-depth topics. Um, that, while they may appeal to lots of people in Australia and New Zealand, might be harder to sell to a broader audience. So that's please don't take that personally. Please don't take that as a slight against either of your lovely countries, which I have never visited but would like to. But that's just sort of the lay of the land there. So um, let's see. So a question from Grand Desir 12. And this is more speaking to the business side of things. Does being a member here via YouTube help my channel more, or go to Patreon? To be perfectly honest, either, like, being a member on either is a huge, huge help to us. Um, which one is better? I mean, my producers could probably come in and give a really granular look at, it's like what cuts are and service fees and like all those kinds of things. I'm not actually involved too much on that side of things. Um, from what I know, I appreciate every single person who gives us any kind of like donation, whether it's big, small, one time, ongoing, anything like that. I really do. Like, it's a huge, tremendous help to us to keep things, to keep the lights on, to keep things going, to pay my bills. And it's like, has anybody bought groceries recently? It's really damn expensive these days. Um, so I mean, from my perspective, if you want to join on YouTube and like take advantage of the of what happens, like the benefits from the YouTube channel, fantastic. If you want to do that through Patreon, again, fantastic. I really appreciate every dollar, cent, whatever people may be able to contribute. Really does mean a lot. So for the people who do contribute on a regular or on a one time, thank you so much. Really do appreciate it. For those who may not be contributing, I'm not going to go around and pass a hat, but if you ever felt like donating, we would certainly that would certainly be a huge benefit and tremendous help. So thank you. Take my business hat off now, I guess. So let's see, what else do we have here? Sorry that as I talk, the questions, there's more comments than I can coming in faster than I can speak to. That's when I talk about how biased my Ukraine war videos are. If you don't like them, don't watch. Really, what it comes down to. I have a personal opinion about a lot of different things. There you go. That's what I'm going to talk to about it. If you don't like the angle, if you don't like what we do in general, if you don't like what anybody does, don't follow. It's really simple. Like, no one's making you be here. So it's everybody has a choice in this. So there you go. Um, let's see. Dorosio asking a follow-up question to what I was talking about with those communication mechanisms, like from 1950 to comparing 1950 to the present. Those communication mechanisms broke down because they weren't being used, and through the 90s especially, they weren't particularly necessary. Um, and when they could have been sort of re-solidified, lots of people didn't think that they continued to be necessary, like through the early 2000s and whatnot. Um, it's only easy to see where we should have done things in retrospect. That's very much it's being politically prescient as to what's going to happen in the future is an incredibly difficult skill to have. Political prognostication is a dangerous thing. We all sort of do it. We all make assumptions, et cetera, et cetera. But um, the mechanisms broke down because they weren't being used. There was little need for that in the 90s. The peace dividend from the what I call the referred to widely broadly as the peace dividend from the end of the Cold War um, very much meant that there wasn't in the 90s, people weren't thinking about the nuts and bolts of nuclear disarmament. People weren't thinking about the nuts and bolts of, it's like what happens when the doomsday clock. I mean, that infamous doomsday clock that people talk about, or that we think about sometimes. Or I should be thinking about it a lot more often than we do. It was being rolled back in the 90s. Like, we actually, like, basically, like anything that happens with the doomsday clock these days, and during the Cold War, ever always seemed to be inching it closer towards, like, towards midnight, towards zero. In the 90s, it was actually being rolled back. There wasn't this feeling that we needed those mechanisms in place, or if we, it's like you pay lip service to something that you think that you need, but then just sort of, it's like, okay, like, yeah, we need it, but you don't pay any attention to it. You let that let it rust. You let it, it's yeah, like you let it fall apart, and it suddenly, like, it's in retrospect, like, yeah, we should have maintained those. But in the '90s, nobody was thinking what things were going to look like now in 2024 or 2022 or 2014 or any of these other sort of like these knee point inflection um, moments of history. So that's yeah. Um, let's see. Sorry, I'm just reading through some of these questions. Well, some follow-up questions about like inequality and things like that. I don't want to totally derail the conversation in that direction because it's yeah. Um, Cookie jar. What do I know about the economic ties between Canada and the USSR? To be honest, I don't really know a ton about this, like a ton of the specifics. For those who don't know, I am Canadian. Um, I'm not a Canadian I'm a Canadian historian in that I am a historian from Canada, but I am not a Canadian historian in that I am not a historian of Canada. Um, there were definitely ties and links between Canada and the Soviet Union that were developed at least from, if not earlier, at least from the 1970s into the 1980s. Wheat was actually a big export going to the Soviet Union. There were reciprocal goods coming back, not great quality and not a ton, but I mean, the Soviet Union was buying Canadian wheat because food scarcity and food security was always an issue through the Soviet Union, sort of a trend within Russia. That's been resolved at this point largely. However, like during the Soviet period, um, food scarcity was certainly an issue, and the Canadians stepped up to be able to help that out. Um, Canada and Ottawa was also used as sort of an intermediary, like a soft introduction point for ideas that the Soviets wanted to float something without bringing it directly to the Russians. They would go through the Canadians first. Like there's lots of little things that went on there. Um, I think probably there's a dumb little story that I can tell about my own personal experience of Soviet products in Canada in the mid 1990s. So this was after the end of the Cold War. It's probably like 1994, 1990, probably 1994, I want to say. Um, at Christmas, my parents, because it's Christmas, my parents gave me, boxer shorts for Christmas, because what's Christmas without getting socks and underwear? Um, and I got these boxer shorts and I opened them up and like that's just I touched them and it's like they felt like they were super rough and like just like what are these like? And I start taking a look at like it's like I don't recognize the brand, et cetera, et cetera. Take a look at it, and they were these boxer shorts, 100% cotton, but made in the Soviet Union. This is 1994, and these terrible quality boxer shorts made in the Soviet Union, made in the USSR, printed right on them. Um, I didn't wear them. They felt terrible. In retrospect, 30 years later, I sort of wish that I still had them because it was funny. We were all laughing about it. Parents didn't even realize that these boxer shorts that they got me were made in the Soviet Union. But here it was, the end of 1994 um, in Canada, and I have these boxer shorts made in the Soviet Union, a country that hadn't existed for 3 years. Kind of wild when you think about that, but um, I would love to have seen what the path was from from those being manufactured to making it under my Christmas tree that year. But anyways, that's there were definitely economic ties. Back to the original point, there was definitely economic ties between Canada and the Soviet Union. I'm not particularly well versed on them, so I apologize. I'm not able to go into really a lot of detail on that. So let's see. Uh, yeah, I think there's some people giving you some further detail and whatnot in terms of electronic exports and things like that. So I hopefully I have not just bored everybody to tears with what has been already answered in the comments. So um, that's and an apology from an Australian. Basically saying that their history is pretty boring. That's oftentimes how Canadian history is also presented as just pretty boring. It actually isn't. There's lots of nuance and some pretty interesting Canadian stuff, but that's the reputation that it has. And I feel that there's more than one or two countries out there that sort of have that same self-deprecating feeling towards their own national histories. Um, that's curious to know what the relationship was between Vietnam and the U.S. after 1975. There wasn't an official relationship between the U.S. in 1975. The two countries didn't actually normalize diplomatic relations until the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. That was right at that point, at that end of the Cold War period. The U.S. didn't officially recognize Vietnam, didn't have diplomatic relations with the country. So I would say pretty shit, to be fair. Pardon my French, but whatever. This is listed as not for kids, so I think I can swear to a reasonable degree. Um, yeah, there was the relationship, which is really interesting when you think that they only normalized for diplomatic relations in by the early 90s, and they are. I'm not going to say quickly, but there is definitely a strategic partnership that's developing there between the two countries. Um, I think it's really important to understand in a modern context that the the way that the relationship that modern Vietnam has to the American war in Vietnam is as one of a series of wars of national liberation. First against I mean, there's a long standing against the Chinese, and that's a recurring theme through Vietnamese history. Then the French, then the Americans. Um, it's an interesting relationship there because of the way that they view that versus this American look at it as like, that is the defining moment of American Vietnamese American relations was the war, whereas the Vietnamese don't necessarily look at it that way. It's an age thing as well. When you look at with such a high percentage of the Vietnamese population being born, I think actually like really like within the last 30 years, but they have no obviously it's like a huge percentage of the Vietnamese population has absolutely no memory of that war, and it was all about moving past that war of liberation and building an independent, unified country. Um, so it is a really interesting topic, one that I really would like to do more research on, but time and like all those things. So that's because that really is a post Cold War type thing. But yeah, let's see. Moving along. You guys are asking great questions. Thank you very much. As I said, like I'm not gonna have the chance to be able to read all of the or answer to all of these. I'm gonna pick the ones that I sort of look at and seem interesting to me that I can sort of talk to a little bit. So yeah. Let's see. Moving along. I'm not necessarily the fastest reader in the world here, so bear with me. Let's Thor the Wolf asking if I can make a video about Icarus buses. Um, I have a soft spot like in my heart for Icarus buses. When I was living in Hungary in the early 90s, Icarus was like, that's all the buses that because I didn't drive. So public transit in Budapest was the way to get around, and it was trams, metro, or buses, and the buses were all Icarus because they were all made in Hungary. And I understand that for the Icarus purists, that there are several versions, like several different Icarus factories in a couple of different countries across East and Central Europe. But the ones that I was like riding in consistently were always the ones from Hungary. I have a very soft, very warm, affectionate, memory. I don't think it was particularly comfortable at the time, but memory and age does this to you. You guys will all find out as you get old, like me. Um, but yeah, I could possibly look at that. I'm not sure that we've got necessarily enough material or enough interest to spin out a full episode on that, but maybe tie that into something as a broader thing. It's an interesting topic. Like we did a Trabant, specifically a history of the Trabant, um, last last end of last summer, I want to say. And that one was actually like I researched and wrote that one myself. That one was a lot of fun to do. Just because I have these personal memories of Trabant, and the way that they were everywhere, and then they slowly just went away, and then they weren't. Um, but people really do seem to like the transit and the everyday functions of life kind of thing. Those videos. So Icarus might be a really good subject to take a look at. So Yeah, that's let's see. Han Solo, who I'm assuming is no relation to Han Solo. Africa being very much affected by the Cold War. Africa is absolutely was a key, is a battleground is a very loaded word, but it was certainly a hot spot within the Cold War on a variety of different fronts. Whether that be the process of decolonization through the late 50s and through the 60s into the 70s, um, whether it's through proxy wars, whether it's through associated to the decolonization process, but the post decolonization process in Africa was very much about winning favor of these new national entities to be able to gain more votes within the United Nations. That was a really big factor um, in terms of like trying to gain influence was the United Nations. For those of you who are like under 30 years old or maybe even less than 40 years old, you may not actually know this, but the United Nations actually used to be a relevant global body. It used to be particularly important in a place where real things actually used to happen. It's a non-entity at this point in my opinion, and what it does, and like a lot, some of its associated bodies, UNESCO and UNICEF, and like there's lots of good things that some of those bodies do, but in terms of the GA, um, at this point, like it really is a, a more when it's a zombie organization, it doesn't have the same gravitas. I like that word. Doesn't have the same gravitas that it used to. Um, but the how the Cold War played out in large parts of Africa was very much about winning favor and influence over countries, so to gain more votes within the United Nations GA, just so that when a vote would happen, you could say that it's the country side, the blue side or the red side came out ahead with X number of votes in favor versus the other side, and then it goes to the Security Council to actually be decided. But anyways, that's um, yeah. So there we go. That's a comment about Africa in the comment about Africa in general during the Cold War. So let's see. Uh, go. Are we planning on doing episodes on Sudan and Palestine during the Cold War? We will definitely be doing further episodes on Palestine. Um, the role of it's one of a. I'm trying to choose my words carefully here. We will absolutely be looking at Palestine. It's very difficult to talk about the situation in the Middle East during the Cold War without viewing Palestine, just because it is such a key and central aspect of that. Terrorism, global terrorism, international terrorism became a really, really big thing during the 80s. It started earlier, but became a really big thing during the 80s. And organizations like the PLO are key central players to that, um, and how countries, whether it's Syria, Libya, Sudan, et cetera, you name all of like basically name any country, they do have some sort of vested side that they're going to take or trying to stay out of it. Whether you're to Egypt and Sadat, like all these things, like the Palestinian question is absolutely central to that history. Yeah, so we absolutely will be coming back to that. Sudan is a more interesting question. I actually don't know too much about Sudan during the Cold War, um, but I mean, it's certainly something that we should probably take a look at to see if it's worth exploring further and maybe bring something up at a later date. So, um, yeah, hopefully that sort of addresses that question a little bit. So let's see. Uh, uh, Sorry, I'm reading these questions. I'm just trying to go through and find that. Let's see. A comment about feedback on the music being too loud in the last video. We've got some new sound equipment that we're playing with. I know there's been some comments going on about very hard S's as well. Music, we do pay attention to all that feedback, and it's when we keep in mind in terms of the S sound. When we record in blocks. It'll be three, four, five, 6 episodes at a time. So sometimes if that sound setting is in one, it may carry over across several. That's the reason. In terms of the mixing on the music, that's certainly with the production team when we're taking a look at that. So yeah, that's we believe it or not, I read every single comment that gets posted. So whether that's a good thing or whether that's a bad thing. Um, I don't let it affect my mental health, so that's a good thing. But I do read all the comments. Some of you got very, very upset at my use of the word decimate in one of the in the first Mongolia video. Uh, uh, you will all be happy to know that when I use the word decimate, I got the reaction that I wanted, and I'm going to continue to use the word decimate in its modern usage. People who want to cling to a 2,000-year-old definition of something from a different language, go ahead, be nut, go nuts. But languages evolve, languages continue. Decimate's one of those words. So, um, yeah, that's. Let's see. I am just going through a couple of more. Sorry, reading here. I appreciate your patience while I do read. Um, let's Holy geez, I'm way back in terms of the questions here. Sorry about that, guys. Um, but, let's see. Some more questions here. This is a really good question, actually. I love this question because I have definite opinions that a lot of people don't agree with. What do I think about the term Cold War? Does it refer specifically to the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union and China and others at various points, or does it refer to the broader post World War II period? The way that I so Because opinions can change and as you get more information, which is the way things are supposed to work. As you gain more information and you learn more things, should be open to be able to change your mind based on evidence and facts. When we first started this channel, I really exclusively thought of the Cold War as being, it's the struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States, and China was sort of an afterthought to that. To be perfectly blunt, um, and that's how I thought about it, and everything that's sort of we like, related to that, and that nothing else mattered. The Cold War, and I've completely changed my mind on that. The Cold War is absolutely a reference to a period of time. The Cold War is like, addressing a period of time from the post Second World War period with roots as far back as the Bolshevik Revolution up until, depending who you want to talk to, 1987, 1988, 1989, 1990, or 1991. I haven't seen anybody argue that the Cold War continues past 1991. But I very much look at it as being like the definition for a period of time rather than that global struggle. That global struggle is part of it acts as a backdrop to everything that happens. It really is sort of the running theme that goes through it. But there's lots of stuff that's going on that are, despite that theme, aren't necessarily specific to that ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. So that's very much how I look at it. That's very much how I frame everything that when I'm thinking about the Cold War. Um, that's how I look at it. So hopefully that answers that question. And I'm sure there's lots of people who actually I'm not sure. I know 100% that there's lots of people out there that will argue with me about that. In my opinion, they're wrong. But the nice thing is that everyone's got an opinion and they're certainly entitled to it. And they can prove they can prove their opinion just as much as I can, um, which is one of those really nice things. So it makes for a good discussion over a couple of beers sometimes. For those who drink beer, anyways, which sometimes I do. So let's see. Say comment about Hitler because we can never get onto the internet without somebody bringing up Hitler. Um, let's see. Can I move on from the Cold War and speak about modern history? We do that sometimes. We're trying something new in terms of, and some of you may have noticed this with our script on Mongolia. We're trying to give a more I hate the word holistic necessarily, like just because it gets bandied around a lot, but we're trying a more complete sort of look at some histories where we're going to start well before the Cold War period, and we're going to roll things past the end of the Cold War necessarily into more modern type history. But in terms of shifting the focus of the channel into exclusively modern history, it's there's no plans to do that. There's going to be topics that interest us that we will address. We've done a few, certainly looking at Putin's Russia and whatnot. Um, but there's not necessarily plans about shifting entirely the focus, but we may continue to touch on those as topics sort of present themselves and what we find interesting to be able to talk to. So yeah, um, bringing the Lada to Canada. You know what? That actually I was so focused on Saskatchewan and wheat that I completely forgot about Lada coming to Canada. Lada was actually successfully sold here for quite a number of years. My neighbor growing up had a Lada, not the Cossack or the Niva or whatever the hell it was called here, the 4x4. It was actually just like one of the four-door sedan Fiat knockoffs. Um, yeah, like I completely the old Lada headquarters building is actually not too far from where my daughter used to take guitar lessons. Yeah, we really should take a look at that as part of the. I'm gonna add that to the. Will add that to the list. Grudgingly, I will add that to the list. So let's see. What are my thoughts on the upcoming UK election? I think the Tories have done this to themselves. Moving on. Let's see. Uh, some questions. People asking about what if Pakistan wins in the. Okay, so the specific question is, what if, like, can I make an episode looking at what if Pakistan won during the Cold War? I don't exactly know where you're referring to specifically with that, but I will very much say this, and I will reiterate what I've said in the past. I don't like what if history. I'm not a big alternative history kind of guy. I'm not a like I don't like sort of looking at those types of things with any. They can be a really interesting way to look at the facts on the ground from a specific moment in terms of what the next step might be. But then, it's like there's a million, billion, trillion, zillion, whatever, like, different permutations of things that can happen here. And then how does that affect the next block of decisions that happens? Like I find what if alternative history turns into wish fulfillment, and it turns into it rather rapidly. Um, so, I mean, if you want to find out what I think should have happened with something, then then get me drunk and start talking about what like alternative histories. But I'm not a big fan of it because I don't think beyond an analysis at the exact moment of deviation that it provides a whole lot of insight into what could have happened because we don't know. There's chance plays such a huge role in so many different things. Um, it's yeah, for me, alternative history is very much this wish fulfillment thing, and I really don't think that has any serious place in terms of what we do here. So, um, my own 2 cents. Lots of people like what if history, and that's great, but I think that's less history, and that's more. It starts looking at. I'm using the word wish fulfillment there, but it becomes fiction at that point, and that's not what we do here. So, anyways, um, let's see. Sorry, I continue to read questions here because you guys are asking them faster than I can read them. So that's um, comments about the UK, end of empire. I just moved my mouse and it just took me to the end, and I've got to scroll back because I'm trying to see sort of what people are commenting on in real time for my brain, not necessarily what you guys have jumped to in the present. Um, would it be worth my while to do an in-depth look at Dag Hammarskjöld and how he shaped the UN? I we've actually done very little work or very little any kind of analysis on the UN really. And that probably, and as I think about that, it's probably a reflection of how we view the UN in the modern sense. It's this useless organization now. I'm very harsh on the UN today. It's this useless organization now. And so, it's like in my brain, like it doesn't really necessarily play this huge central role, um, or anything in the past, and that's a failing on my part because, and I'm willing to admit that the UN absolutely was this really key and important thing, and Dag Hammarskjöld was a key figure within that. You've got, I mean, there's big names within the UN, like from a diplomatic history perspective, whether that's Utant or Dag Hammarskjöld or um, I can't even think of the first, like the first general secretary. I can't think of his name right now. It's killing me. But um, yeah, and then like, you get into the 90s where it's Kofi Annan and like Boutros Boutros Ghali. So nice they named him twice. Like the UN really was this key and important battleground in the Cold War, and this key dialogue mechanism. It really, we really do need to come back and take a deeper look at it, and try to stress that because I think a lot of people do forget about that. And Doug Hammarskjöld was probably a really good place to start, with that. And I'm sure somebody's going to jump into the comments and let me know who the first general secretary or the first couple of general secretaries were. Specifically, the guy I'm thinking of, I think he was Norwegian, and he was the guy during Korea. Like, it's killing me. So if somebody wants to jump in, please do. Yeah, let's see. Uh, Reading YouTube comments makes me lose brain cells. Yes, Russ, like it often does. Um, it it's a wonderful, wild world out there. So and everyone's got an opinion, and everyone has a vehicle to be able to express it. So, and I'm the lucky one that gets to read them all to decide. It's like what gets to stay, and because some of them out the door they go because I we're not leaving some of the trash that people post up for other people to read. So that's the bullet that I'm willing to take for all of you, my friends. Uh, yeah, let's see. A Romania episode. Funny you say that because I was actually just talking to a colleague of mine about that. Yeah, we're gonna be taking a look at Romania, hopefully quite soon. Romania is a really interesting case. They're a member of Comic Con. They're a member of Warsaw Pact, um, and especially from the mid '60s or so, once Ceausescu takes over and comes into power, um, he just sort of does his own thing. Um, Romania is landlocked isn't the right word, but Romania is certainly blocked from easy access to the West geographically. There's no borders shared with Western countries, um, so less of a risk that it's sort of going to drift away. But it's doing its own thing. Like it's forging closer ties to China at some points. It's doing like this whole austerity thing. In the '80s, after the fiasco of like loans, kind of like IMF loans coming due. Um, yeah, Romania is a really interesting story, and then the way that it ends, obviously, in Christmas Day, 1989. Um, it's the only one of the East Central Bloc socialist states that ended in a proper violent revolution. I mean, it was peaceful pretty much throughout, with the noted exception of Romania. So it really is an interesting case. Pro-natalist, like really like austere super austerity combined with pro-natalist policy. There's all this stuff. Really quite fascinating. So we definitely are going to be jumping in on taking a look at Romania in the near future. So, let's see. Sorry, guys. Give me 2 seconds here. Um, Ibn Ismail. That's oh no, wait. That's did I just read the wrong comment? I did read the wrong comment. Oh well, I mean, Ibn Ismail asking about if there's going to be a history of Cambodia. Sort of we might be just jumping in a little late. We I talked about it earlier. We are going to be jumping in and taking a look at Cambodia and the Cold War. Um, it's Cambodia is pretty. pretty central in terms of sort of that 70s aspect for Southeast Asia with the, the impact of the American involvement, how that sort of sets the stage for the rise of Pol Pot, the genocide that happens, um, the Vietnamese, like the Vietnamese invasion and occupation. Like there's all this stuff that happens in the post, like through the late 70s and into the 80s that really is central to a lot of like Cold War happenings and dialogue and things like that. So Cambodia is definitely something that we're going to be coming back to. It's just not quite yet. We just need to get ready for that. So um, let's see. Cyrus asking a question about how Japan coped with the atomic bombing and the subsequent occupation by the Allies, but still became a close ally to the United States. We actually have a several episode run looking at Japan in that post-war, like that post-occupation or that post-war and the occupation period, including like economic, like rise, et cetera, et cetera. Definitely, I'm not because we've done those episodes, Cyrus. I would say please go check them out. Um, Added viewership is always kind of nice. Share them with your friends. All of our videos, share them with your friends, your enemies. Just share them. Make people watch them. Watch them from different IP addresses. It all helps. Um, but yeah, like that's it. It's a really interesting. It is an interesting story in terms of how that was done, but it was very much this part of the deal was like tearing down societal structures and letting them be rebuilt by the Japanese, but certainly with oversight and input and control from the United States. It's an interesting story to take a look at that. So, but definitely go check those videos out, please. Let's see. Bum, sorry, guys. I know me sitting here going bum bum all the time while I'm trying to read questions is boring as fuck. Let's see. Okay, this is where you're going to get me a little bit ranty. Um, an intermission in the Cold War. Um, so, and this isn't necessarily ranty specifically to your specific question or comment here. It's more just this idea that, like, it's like, well, the Cold War never ended. It's continuing now. It's like, well, no, and that's not how these things work. Like, I mean, that's sort of like claiming that the Second World War is just a is a continuation of the Napoleonic Wars, so we should just call it the Napoleonic Wars. It's not how history works. There's we create labels to help define things. Was the Cold War from 1945, 1917, 1945, 1947, whatever timeline you want to pick, till the fall of the Soviet Union? That's the Cold War. Are we possibly entering a new Cold War right now? Yes. I think that there's a real possibility that we do that. We could also be entering the period of a hot war. Things are not looking good out there, and there's the real possibility of escalation. So just to assume that there's a lack of general hostilities right now doesn't that's just as something to think about doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be a cold war. This could just be the year leading up to like the actual shooting war that starts in 2025, for example. Um, so in terms of applying labels, like this whole idea that it's like, oh well, the Cold War never ended, it just continued. It's like that's bullshit. Like I'm sorry, like that's again my opinion, but anybody who thinks otherwise is wrong. It's the Cold War ended in 1991. Like the Soviet flag came down, and that was the unequivocally that was absolutely the last possible time that you could say that the Cold War was still going on. This is a new conflict. This is a new thing. Is it rooted in the past histories? Yeah, absolutely, because that's how history works. There isn't this isn't a continuation of what's gone on before. This is something new. This is something different. Um, and to say otherwise is I think is just incorrect. So that's you can send me angry emails later. That's totally fine. I read those too. So um, let's see. Lots of questions about Cambodia coming in here, but it's all the same questions. So I think I've addressed that one. So um, let's see. Sorry, just scroll down. But man, I think I either need a new mouse or YouTube is messing me around. But it's probably that I need a new mouse. The 15, actually, it's like the $10 Amazon special is surprisingly not that reliant over the long term. But um, there it is, Trygve, and I'm horribly mispronouncing his name because I'm not a Norwegian speaker. I've worked with a lot of Danes over my career, the last 20, 25 years, and Scandinavian pronunciation continues to elude me. So I beg forgiveness from anybody out there um, who's just heard me pronounce that name. I'm very sorry. I will beg forgiveness from everybody in terms from any episode that we've ever done in terms of my pronunciation. I am an Anglophone. I'm the worst kind of Anglophone. That's the only language that I speak. Um, I've taken language lessons in a bunch of other languages, but I'm not a. My brain doesn't necessarily absorb different language particularly well, unfortunately. Um, yeah. So, and then added on top of that, I'm doing a script in like a flowing script in English and trying to toss in different place names and you know names of people in that, and pronunciation can be incredibly difficult. So I apologize to anyone whose language I may have or I have butchered in the past, but that's just the way that works sometimes. So please, I beg forgiveness. I can read the names, saying them out loud is something different. So any plans for a video on the Sri Lankan Civil War? Yep, absolutely. That is a topic that I have a personal interest in. I lived in Colombo for several years during the mid 1980s at a point where things were not particularly good. So I'm familiar with the sort of the beats and the steps of what happened in Sri Lanka during that period, and that's something that I would like to sort of take a for myself to be able to take a deeper look at, but also to be able to share that with a wider audience because I don't think that there's necessarily a lot of people out there that are particularly familiar with the ebbs and flows of the that civil war. Ba-dum-bum-bum. Yeah, cool to see an episode about German reunification. We absolutely will get to that, but that's I don't want to call that a palate cleanser. But that's definitely something that's going to come towards the end of the channel's run. When you start seeing us talking about German reunification and doing episodes on that, we're getting close to the end. Um, that's sort of one of those. It's like the if you're Italian. It's like when they serve coffee at the end. It's like okay, like drink your coffee and get the fuck out. Um, that's sort of what the German reunification stuff is going. Those episodes are going to be. So that's again, pardon me swearing. It's what I do. This thing is marked as not for kids. So, and if you don't know that word or offended by that word, let's see. Jason Smith asking if we can discuss Ukraine's role in the Cold War. We've done several episodes of on the history of Ukraine. Um, yeah, like we've done some. Go check them out. Like economic development of Ukraine during in the Soviet period. We've looked at the transfer of Crimea. Like there's definitely some Ukraine themed episodes. If you're interested and you're curious, certainly go check them out. Will we do more? Yeah, we'll probably come back to some at some point. Ukraine and Ukrainian history obviously is very relevant, and there's a general interest in it at the moment. Hopefully, that interest is not waning because I think it is a really important ongoing subject to be able to understand what is happening in the present day. There's a lot of it's a very complicated, uh, complex history with some very different viewpoints. And knowledge is power to sound kind of trite, but there we go. Uh, Jordan asking if you can suggest some books on the Cold War. Yes, I can. Um, but depending what kind of books you're looking for depends on what kind of suggestions you're interested in. I would certainly very much suggest, if you're looking for a general sort of broad overview, um, The Cold War by Odon Vestat is an excellent place. It was written, I want to say it's 6 or 7 years old at this point, but it's a sort of a generalized look at the entire broad period. It's very well written. It's very accessible, but it's definitely based around more modern sourcing and more modern scholarship. Um, it's an academic book, but it doesn't necessarily read like an academic book. Lawrence Luthie's The Cold Wars is also excellent. He very much does take an Asia focus on that, so it's not necessarily looking at the sort of the struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union specifically, so much as how some of that played out in Asia and especially around China. But again, excellent and a nice introduction, a good overview to that. Um, what else? Paul Anderson's Cold War Killing Fields is a really interesting challenge to the idea that the Cold War was a bloodless conflict. Millions and millions of people died during the Cold War. They just didn't happen to be, for the most part, they weren't white people. It was people across Asia and Africa and Latin America that were being actively killed in various conflicts, whether it's the Korean War, whether it's it's like the genocide in Bangladesh, whether it's the Iran-Iraq War, civil strife in China, like the wars of decolonization across Africa. I mean, Angola has a huge bloody death toll to it. There's lots of different challenges that can be brought to that, and Paul Anderson's Cold War Killing Fields is an excellent look at that. You can go back and look at some older scholarship, even some early post Cold War stuff that was published in the early 90s. But the important thing to read with that is that a lot of that stuff tends to be written from a very especially in English, tends to be written from a very triumphalist point of view, like the "we won the Cold War. This is the history of how we won the Cold War." There's possibly being written a little too close to the end of it to see, like, sort of what those long-term impacts and everything were. But anyways, that's Cold War Revisited by uh, Gaddis, John Lewis Gaddis. Yeah. Anyways, that's a couple of suggestions. If there's more specific, nuanced topics, toss them in, like, that you're looking for a recommendation on. Toss them into the comment and see if I can make a recommendation on that. So, um, but because yeah, I mean, there's a ton of books out there about the Cold War, from broad histories to very specifics. So. Uh, Let's see. Bum, bum. Stephen Kotkin was complaining about finishing the university and publishing a book about the Soviet Union right before the whole thing came crashing down and the Cold War is finished. Are they relevant again? I don't necessarily think that any kind of literature or any kind of scholarship ever becomes irrelevant. Um, it just depends on the word I'm looking for. I don't think anything becomes irrelevant, but how we choose to read that work has to be, maybe needs to be adjusted. Like if I'm reading histories of things that were written in the 60s or the 70s, how I read that is very different from something that's been published in the present. That has to do a lot with access to sources. It has a lot to do with viewpoints. There's a whole lot of things, but that isn't to say that that scholarship from the 60s or the 70s or whatever period is irrelevant. It just needs to be contextualized in terms of what we now know, how we think about things, and sort of like how viewpoints have changed over time given more information being presented generally. So um yeah, that's, I mean, that's how I look at things. It's, I mean, the no scholarship is completely, and interpret whatever the source is. um yeah, let's see. Um, Somebody making the comment that they love the rant. Thank you. I'm not sure which rant that was. I do a lot of ranting during these. So, how long have we been talking now? Just an hour. Okay, just that's, and my sandwich that I got, I still haven't eaten that. So, um, we're gonna put a time limit on this because I am hungry and I need to go walk my dogs because it's a lovely day. But yeah, a couple people making donations. Well, thank you very much. That is fantastic. That's CIA Jim. That CIA just made a donation to us. That makes me a paid informant at this point. So not in the slightest, but yeah, thank you very much. That is incredibly appreciated. Thank you very much. Anytime anybody is willing to part with any of their hard earned money, it really is. It does mean a lot. Like I subscribe to a couple of Patreon channels and whatnot, and it's who I choose to give my money to is very important to me. Um, so I mean and I very much respect and am grateful for anybody who chooses to share any of their hard earned dollars with us. So thank you very much. Uh, let's see. Redcoat asking, how many languages do I speak? I speak English, and there's a lot of days where I speak English badly at that. So I think I may have addressed that already before you asked that question, but or after you asked that question. But I speak English. That's about it. I've studied some French, I've studied some German, I've studied some Russian, and I used to speak pretty good Spanish. But my Spanish only really gets better once I've had a couple of cervezas. So there we go. That's uh, Vitaly Chernobyl rewriting the words for father figure to include tiny Kaliningrad, which is probably the most weird thing I'm going to read today. But yeah, thank you. That's great. Let's see. Oh yeah, you guys, this conversation's gone well past me like rambling on here. Let's, um, comment. Somebody. This is. I love this. Not to be controversial, it's not. It's history. Will we do a video on Kissinger and the opening up to China? Yes, we absolutely will be taking a look at Kissinger and Nixon going to China. Um, it is a really huge and important topic. It is a key pivotal point of the Cold War, and it's a pivotal point in modern history as well. But I guarantee you that if anybody here is a fan of Henry Kissinger, that video is not going to be particularly flattering. I am no fan of him, so but yes, we will absolutely be taking a look at that. And Henry Kissinger, history's greatest monster, certainly will be playing a prominent role. So there we go. Let's see. Um, Lots of back and forth here about who should own Kaliningrad. The only thing that I can say really to that is, and this is one of the issues with irredentism, wanting a chunk of territory back that used to be yours. It's changed in the meantime. Like, does Poland, does Germany, does Lithuania, like the Commonwealth, do they want Kaliningrad back? They think they want Königsberg back, but what are they going to do with it? Those aren't Germans that live there anymore. They're Russians. So do you want to invite X number of like hundreds of thousands, or I'm not even sure what the population of Kaliningrad Oblast is, but I mean, this is all unless you're going to commit a giant, like a giant war crime and expel all the Russians that live there. Suddenly, that's something to think about and something to consider. This isn't just lines on a map; these are people. Do you just want to create the grievances for the next round of conflict? Sure, that's a great way to do it. But I mean, these are real things that need to be considered when you start talking about places like Kaliningrad. Um, it's a Whether you like it or not, it used to be German. It used to be Lithuanian or Polish. Well, back in the day, it was probably somebody else's at some point in there as well. But it's Russian now, and it is populated by vast majority ethnic Russians. Something to consider when you start talking about it. This is one of the challenges with irredentism and wanting pieces of territory back that you consider that somebody might consider to be a country might consider to be historically theirs. There's still people that live there, and how you accommodate and how it's like what you do with that population becomes really key and really central. So um yeah, that's uh, Sorry, that's do good. Yeah, this is more of a historiography kind of question, but anything that John Lewis Gaddis writes on the Cold War is exceptional. John Lewis Gaddis is an excellent writer. I have read lots of his work, and I've read some of his stuff that he published, like certainly in the early '90s, and it really does have this super triumphalist. It's like this is why we won the Cold War, and it lacks a lot of the information that's come out and has been presented. He, I mean, historians are biased. Like, there's no anybody who tells you that a historian isn't biased. Any historian isn't biased is full of shit or doesn't understand what a historian actually does. John Lewis Gaddis doesn't hide where his biases are, which makes it nice and convenient. He's an exceptional writer. I just don't always necessarily trust isn't the right word, but I always do read what he's writing with a grain of salt because I know what his biases are. And it's reading, and again, this is coming back to how you how you read and interpret things depending when they've been written, who's writing them, what the perspective is, et cetera, et cetera. John Lewis Gaddis is an excellent example of that. He's a phenomenal writer. Go read his things, read articles, read books. He really is a fantastic writer, and he knows his stuff. He's presenting his arguments incredibly well. But you do have to read for content, and you have to read to understand exactly why he's presenting and talking about what specifically he's talking to and about. So, um, my own viewpoint on Jim Lewis Gaddis. So there we go. And that, I mean, I could. That's going to be the case for any historian. Um, just I could speak to Gaddis particularly because I've done a bunch of reading on his, and I have specific opinions. So there we go. Um, I think I'm almost running out of questions here, guys. Amazing. I'm almost caught up. How many books on North and South Yemen are in the Cold War? There's not a lot. Well, not in English. Yemen is a rather. I mean, you'll find stuff on the Aden Emergency, which is very much a Brit. It's going to have a very British slant to it. Pro nationalist Yemeni type stuff, pro socialist Yemen. Yemen's a really it's super interesting country. It was two countries. It's one. Is it a country? Is it a failed state? Like there's all kinds of discussions about Yemen. Um, but in terms of like serious scholarship during the Cold War period, there's very little that I've seen. It may exist. It likely does exist. It's just not something that I've come across. So um, interesting country. Um, Certainly has made the headlines and made the news a fair number of times in recently, but not any kind of good way, unfortunately. So yeah, um, I feel like this channel will never end. There's days I feel that way too. When you focus on a country or Cold War topic, it's almost always a rabbit hole. It is. I mean, that's like genuinely, and I've spoken to this. It was probably a couple of years ago during a live stream, but when we first started doing this, we figured that we were going to run episodes for about 2.5 years, and we'd sort of casually map things out to about a 2.5 year run, and then we'd wrap it and maybe find something else, or each go our separate ways and never talk to each other again, or whatever. We're 5 years. We're past 5 years now. Um, and chronologically, we haven't really even sort of like we're just starting to scrape into the 60s at this point. Although the chronology thing is starting to fall a little to the wayside, um, but yeah, like I mean, it's really interesting to sort of to think about this. That like we find these rabbit holes to dive down. Like it's like in one rabbit hole leads to another rabbit hole. And it's this constant. It's also a huge period of time. It's a I mean, it's a 50-year span of time that we can take a look at globally. There's really is an innumerable number of topics that we can cover. It's just a question of what topics we do cover that are still going to appeal to a relatively wide audience. Um, I mean, we could do like literally we could do an episode on artisanal basket weaving, the artisanal basket weaving industry of Kerala, um, but no one's going to watch that. We could do it, but should we do it? That's always the question. So that's yeah, that's where we stand on that. This is at the end of the day, this is still a this is a commercial operation. Like we do have bills to pay. Like there's costs involved with all of these, with every episode, et cetera, et cetera. Um, if nobody's watching, then we're not here. That's the end of the day. Like this isn't a. I, my wife says I'm not a good person. I'm probably not that great a person. Just kind of mean, but w- we have to watch our costs and make sure that that altruism. We can't do this just out of altruism. But that's really at the end of the day. I love that we do this, and I love that we can find topics and sort of share knowledge and information to people who are interested in it. I think that's great. I love the internet for that, but at the end of the day, like, but there's, as I said, there's still bills to pay. So yeah. Let's see. Somebody making the suggestion to give Kaliningrad to Liechtenstein, however you pronounce that country. Um, sure, why not? That's yeah. What could be worse, right? That's um, let's see. Sorry, I'm just taking a look here. Uh, artisanal basket weaving next April Fools. Yeah, exactly. Like no, it's and 10 people will watch it, and a bunch of people will unsubscribe, and a bunch of people will make anti-Semitic comments, and I will just end up being sad and drinking alone in my backyard with my dogs. So that's yeah. So maybe we might still do it actually, but we'll see. I'm gonna start wrapping this up now because again, my sandwiches. It's a nice time for this lovely steak sandwich that my wife brought me. I don't think she didn't know that I was gonna do this, so um, but I'd like to go eat my steak sandwich at some point. So I'm gonna. If anybody else has any kind of questions or anything, like now's the time to sort of drop them into the chat. That's the word I'm looking for. Um, Otherwise, we will start wrapping this up. Again, probably going to be another little bit before there's a new episode coming out, but we've got some really, in my opinion, we always have interesting episodes, but we've got some really interesting, like different topics that coming up that hopefully will appeal to all of you who have bothered to stick around for this long. If you've stayed from the beginning, my God, you're some sort of a sadist. Um, but yeah, hopefully, let's see. Okay, quest last question. Any video idea for Antarctica? Yes, but I'll be honest, Zachary. I do have an idea, like, because Antarctica is this demilitarized scientific research only by international treaty and by international agreement. It's this really interesting sort of topic. Is it enough to do a 20-minute, 30-minute episode on? Probably not. Um, at least one that's interesting to enough people. Again, coming back to this issue, but working it into the idea of this, because there's a sub thread that has sort of been developing in my mind about the idea of science and research being this key thread through the Cold War, of of détente, whether it's like, whether it was on purpose or whether like it wasn't on purpose and it was intentional. It's this idea that there was like the space race is a really good example of that. By the late 60s and especially into the 70s, collaboration was the name of the game. And it was, I mean, even in the 50s under Eisenhower, the International Year of Science, like there's all these different programs and these different things that are happening in terms of collaborative effort between the United States, Europe, and the Soviet Union and its partner countries partner, um, that as these means of continued dialogue and interaction and exposure. Um, yeah, so I'm part of me wants to think of like sort of like maybe we can like fit the whole Antarctica thing in that way because it is a really it's this big giant dry continent at the bottom of the world that that we never really think about till like a penguin dies or something. Um, Making shit up now, but anyways, yeah, like it would be a really interesting. I think it would be a really interesting thing. We just need to figure out how to frame that. So that's yeah. Um, China videos. Yeah, well, there'll be China videos. That's hopefully you guys liked the episode that we did last week. It was sort of that one of the first of our longer format series. The I really liked the idea that of trying to like this flipping back and forth between like sort of what happened 100 years ago and how it plays out and impacts things today. Actually it was a really fascinating way to approach that. Um, and Craig, who was the primary researcher and writer on that one, did a fantastic job. But I think it was actually a really important episode to sort of thread this historical narrative that's history doesn't happen in isolation. History happens as a result of things that happened 100 years ago. It happens as a result of 20 years ago, and how all of those things play together. Um, so yeah, that's hopefully you guys liked that, and we want to try to do more like that. So yeah. Um, so that's on that note, at an hour and 20 minutes for an impromptu thing, I'm going to go eat my steak sandwich and I'm going to go take my dogs to the park. Hopefully, everybody has a fantastic Saturday and enjoys themselves. Um, or, it's like maybe it's Sunday where you are. It's very possible. Again, if you've stayed with me for this long, thank you so much. Um, we'll try to do one of these again sooner than like sort of the gap between the last one and this one. Um, but yeah, um, I hope everybody has a fantastic weekend and gets to spend time either with people that they want to spend time with or doing things that they want to do. So that's I'm going to go back and probably play some more Fallout tonight. So I'll take care, guys. Bye.